Hello, dear brothers and sisters. As we have been doing this every day, it's 11 o'clock in the morning. Do our uh, Bible study about the same passage today as we did last night, which is the part of Mark's Gospel where he talks about Jairus' daughter being very sick, and then Christ is asked to go and heal her. On the way, something happens, and that's what we're going to talk about today. As I said earlier, Christ was slow in going because of the crowd. People come and throng against him, and they kind of push against him where he slows down. He answers perhaps questions people have, problems. They come to him with them. And most essentially, most importantly, what happens is this woman comes to him and asks for healing, but not in a regular way. She does not. She does not excuse herself, or she does not ask anything. She simply talks to herself and comes to Christ and says that if I touch him, even his garments from behind, I would be healed. And so she comes and touches him, and Christ notices immediately that power came out of him, and he communicates that to his disciples. And the answer was very interesting. That is, that there's a lot of people here, teacher, and everybody is touching you. And what do you mean by people touching you? Because everybody, like I said, everybody is touching. But Christ was talking about a specific person, and that specific thing happened, and that's what he was talking about. And in this story, there is a separation. There's kind of a difference between everybody else and this woman who comes for a specific reason with a specific request, and she receives what she wanted. I want to talk about an important concept here, as far as our relationship goes with God. There are several times in Gospels where we see that a lot of people were following Christ, and only one or two people receive attention from him. And this old woman, not to everybody else. And only her prayers were heard. And in this case, there's a crowd around Christ, but this woman comes and receives healing even without having a conversation, even without talking with him. So what are the other stories? Let me give you a little detour here. The others are the story of Zacchaeus, where he is blocked by the crowd, and another story is blind Bartimaeus, where he also was told not to approach Christ, but he insists on it, and he does approach Christ. In this case, these three examples, there are other examples where the crowd prevents from reaching to Christ, and they go over the hurdle, and they reach Christ, and they find their request, the answer to their request. The classical example for that is the four men bringing their friend who was paralyzed to Christ in the house, and the house was blocked by the crowd. So let's talk about every one of these stories and see what is common and how does it work when you approach Christ. How do you receive what you ask for? Uh, Number one is obviously this story where the crowd was so thick that even the disciples did not see that this woman came and touched Christ and received her healing. But the most important aspect of this story is her conviction, that she was so convinced that if she reaches to that point, she will get what she wants, because Christ will give her her desired healing of her disease. And the second story, as I said, is the tax collector Zacchaeus, who was short by stature, and he could not see Christ, but he was so eager to see him. He studies the way that he has to go through, and he climbs a tree on that road, and he makes sure that he has contact with Christ. And in that story, Christ tells Zacchaeus that he's going to go into his house, and that day salvation came to his house. So you can see that again, there's a crowd, there's throng of people, a lot of people who are actually surrounding Christ and blocking him. And then there is this one individual who really wants to see him and goes over difficulties and problems to reach him. The third example that I told you about is blind Bartimaeus, who was a beggar, a blind person sitting on the side of the road, and Christ was going by, and there was a big crowd going with him. And as Bartimaeus hears the noises coming from a distance, he asks people, "Who is that?" And they say, "It's Jesus of Nazareth. This is Jesus going by." And he immediately jumps up and says, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." What happens is the crowd stops him from reaching out to Christ, and they tell him, "Be quiet and sit down," considering that perhaps Christ doesn't have time for people like that. And it's very interesting that Bartimaeus continues to shout and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And what happens is the text says that Christ stood still, and looked at Bartimaeus and specifically asked what he wants, what is his request, and he immediately gave his healing according to his faith. So that's the third example. And the fourth example, as I said, is a classical example where we see not only the person who desires to go to Christ, but also we see the person who, the four persons, the community that brings that one person to Christ. And that is the fourth and classical example of the relationship between Christ and humanity in two ways. Number one is in a big scale with the whole crowd, and number two, in a small scale with individuals, with persons, and a community around that person, bringing that person to Christ. So these are very important concepts for our spiritual life, for our daily life in Christ, our daily relationship with Christ, and our community life in the church, where we go to relate to God. So we can be in two modes in our life. We can be in a mode of a crowd that is out of curiosity surrounding Christ, being with him and questioning him and just being there. They have no requests, they have no needs, and they don't have trust that if they even had the needs, because every one of us does have a need, that God can satisfy, God can reach out and bless us with. But is there enough strength of faith? Is there enough strength of trust that if we ask, we will receive? And I will give you an example of the Russian saint John of Kronstadt. It is very interesting that he was using the phrase from the liturgy where the phrase from the New Testament is kind of a little bit changed, where Christ says to his disciples, if two or three are gathered together, and whatever you ask, I will give it to you. And John of Kronstadt was using the liturgical phrase saying, because you said that if we are two or three gathered together and we ask for something, you will give it to us. Now we are asking, Lord, please give it to us. And John of Kronstadt lived in the 20th century. He's considered a 20th century prophet. And the story about him, his life story, is that he was never he was never refused by God. Everything that he asked, he received, and not for himself. He was always praying for others. He was always praying for the sick. There was miles of people, lines of people in front of his door, going and asking for his prayers for different reasons. And his prayers reached to the heart of where Christ is, where God is, into God's heart. And God granted whatever John asked. And in these stories, we see why. Because there's the bigger crowd that followed Christ, and then there are these persons who have this strong faith and trust in what they want and a desire to receive what they want, and they know that the only person can give it to them is Christ himself, and they reach out to Christ in that strong urge and sense of urgency, and they ask for what they need, and Christ gives it to them there and then. In order to know how that works, we have two other examples, where one is the Phoenician woman that comes to Christ. And on Phoenician woman's example, Christ shows to his disciples how they should pray. That the Phoenician woman asks for the daughter's healing, and Christ kind of ignores her for a while. And then the second time and the third time, finally the disciples say that she has started to bother them, and that maybe he should resolve her problem and send her away. And Christ says, refuses one more time, saying, interesting concept. I briefly touch upon it and we move on. But sometimes it seems like it's very rude to compare someone to the dog and saying, it's not good to give to the dogs. But what the woman responds to Christ's answer about this is that even the dogs eat from the crumbs that fall down from the table. So today we probably wouldn't have this concept in our lives, but at that time there were two kinds of dogs. There were dogs that were street dogs that were living outside on their own by themselves, and they were very ungrateful to what they received. They would, the fathers teach about this, and they say that these dogs lived around butcheries and in the neighborhoods, on the sides of the neighborhoods, and people would throw bread at them or a piece of meat or whatever. And what they would do, they would grab that food and run away, and they would eat it, and they would never come back because that's all they needed. Remember what we talked about a couple days ago about the demoniac. When Christ satisfies his essential human need, which is restoration of this person into the community, in relationship with others and with God, what does the man say to Christ? He says, I want to go with you. I want to be your disciple. I want to be your follower. So he doesn't come just for that particular thing and then he takes it. It's a transaction that happens between him and Christ, and then he disappears. That's not how our relationship with God works. We just don't remember God when we need something, and we go to Him and ask for it, and then when we receive it, we forget about God. That's usually what happens. In the story of the demoniac, we see when he receives what he wants, then he wants to become the disciple of Christ, and that's what Christ desires. But there is also a very good nuance there, that Christ does not take advantage of the fact that he has given to him something and now he's going to manipulate him to become his disciple. He actually, in fact, says, no, go and tell people what happened to you. So it's not that he was urging to create a gang around him who are going with him, and he feels good about it. But what he wants is that he wants them to receive what they received from God and glorify God. And that's why what we say sometimes is an expression. If we do something and somebody thanks us, what do we say in response? Glory be to God. So when I do something good to you, for you, you say thank you. I should, if I was honest and a God-loving person, uh, I should say that that glory, that thank, should go to God, because God is the one who gives me the life and the ability of doing anything that I could do to help someone or to do something for someone. So I did a long detour, but these are important concepts, that the discipleship of Christ doesn't necessarily mean the same thing that we have today. People getting disciples or getting followers, and then using those followers or the power of those followers to do the things that they desire to do. And that's what actually at the time the Jews were understanding, that the Messiah would be someone who comes and gains some disciples, creates an army, and fights the Romans. But that's not what Christ did. He came and he helped humans to understand what the authentic relationship is between God and humans, and that they need to glorify God, or lift it up. And he thanked God, and he broke it and gave it to his disciples to distribute to the other people. So that's the discipleship, where what we do through our life and our what has happened to us in our relationship with God, we bring other people to God independently. They don't have to become our followers so that we direct them where to go. They can be God's disciples, God's Christ disciples, God's people on their own. Sometimes we may need to help each other one step or two steps ahead of each other. We can give each other a hand, but that's what Christ gave as an example through his relationship with his disciples and his friends. And so, coming back to the crowd, we see in the Gergesin demoniac story that there was a crowd there too. And what does the crowd say to Christ? They say, "Leave our country. Don't stay with us." Although they just saw what just happened with this man who they had been suffering with many, many years, couldn't contain him in any way or any shape. But they tell Christ, who was the source of his life, who was the source of his freedom, who was the source of his restoration into society, they tell him to leave. So you can see that why there is a difference in this way. Well, so in this story, the woman is so bad in her condition that she can't even show up in the society, and that's why she comes to Christ in a hidden way and touches him from behind. Because at that time, people who had some kind of a blood issue in their life, they were considered unclean, and they should not be seen in public, and anything that they touched would be considered unclean. Therefore, they were kind of shunned out of the society to live on their own. And I don't know how they took care of themselves or who took care of themselves. Today we have this pandemic that has shut us into our homes, and we can actually relate to that concept that you can't go out into the streets and do whatever you want, and you know, if you go out, you need to wear gloves, we need to wear masks, because you don't want to harm other people. And that's what kind of these people were going through, although they were not harmful to the society, but that's what the understanding of the time was. And the worst thing is, it's not that they respectfully kept distance from each other like we should do today, is that what they were considered evil, they were considered bad, so nobody wanted to touch them, nobody wanted to get close to them. So there was kind of not only social distancing that we have today, but it was social degradation, that these were lower grade people that, you know, you don't want to get close to them, like the lepers and others. And uh, and that's because there was not the love of Christ, of sacrificial sort, of sacrificial kind of love, had not been revealed to humans yet, that he's here. And he did clean a lot of people who were not supposed to be in the society. And so that's why this woman comes and touches from behind. What I want to mention is that by the standards of the society, this woman was not considered unclean and not good. In And the crowd who was there, they were dignified people, and they were questioning Christ, and they were talking with him and all that stuff. But in the eyes of God, this woman was more important, or God paid attention to her. But the others who were there is no account about them, that they received anything, that they received any benefit being around Christ. Can you imagine you were sitting with Christ, or you were walking on the street and you saw him there? That's like, I'm getting goosebumps as I'm talking about it. That's like the most amazing thing that you can ever experience. But can you now imagine that this crowd was so ignorant? They were just there, and they were just saying things, or asking him stupid questions and trying to test him and all these things. And then there is this one individual person that gives us an example how we should relate to him. We should relate to him with awe. And that's what happens when she touches and Christ notices her. She is in fear. She stands far and she's in awe. And she reveals the entire truth, the gospel says. She tells everything the way it is. And what does that mean? That is confession, dear brothers and sisters. When we open our heart to Christ and we tell him everything as it is, the way that the life is, the way that we are, the things that we have hidden in our heart, in the depth of our soul, she basically opens herself up completely. Her soul is transparent now in front of Christ. So that's what happens in an authentic relationship with God. And that's what we need to learn today. That this woman, with all the deficiencies that she had, is an example of a human being, a regular human being. She wasn't any different from the others, because the others had problems too, but some of the problems were hidden. We didn't know their problems. They didn't share their problems. Obviously, this woman had a problem that she couldn't hide anymore, and that had put her in a society in a lower state, and she had been kind of sent out of the society to live on her own. But the others also had problems. And that's what we need to consider when we are relating with God and we are relating with others, that we need to be considerate of other people's shortcomings, mistakes, even sicknesses, whatever they have, in the light of our own shortcomings and mistakes. That no one is perfect, and that we are to consider other people through the lens of our own imperfections, and from that, love only comes out. And when we consider that, when we see other people in the light of our imperfections, then we can relate to God in a very transparent way, that we have recognized our humility, through our humility, our need from God. And that is our salvation. Sometimes the wrong thing that we do is that we have a laundry list, and it's okay to have a laundry list, as Dr. Fitzgerald used to tell me when we had our TV program together, is that it's okay to have a laundry list. Sometimes it's fine to tell God what we need in that sense. But the essential, the most important, I would say the only thing that we need is our salvation. And in that category of requests, we should be asking God, like this woman. We should be in awe of God, knowing that even if we have the smallest contact with God, that our salvation will be granted to us. That if God pays attention to us in the slightest, smallest way, in a shortest uh, time, that our life will be transformed like this woman's life was transformed. She had been suffering 12 years from this disease, and just the small contact with Christ changes her life completely. And like Bartimaeus, if we insist, if we are not afraid of the people who are telling us, oh, or intimidated by the other people who don't go to church or don't believe in God anymore, or whatever, if we are not intimidated by them and we insist like Bartimaeus did, that Christ will stand still and pay full attention to our needs and will respond to our needs. But sometimes what we want is we want to sit in our office and Christ come and show us and get an appointment with us to have a meeting with us and meet with us and prove us that he exists. In reality, it's a hard work, dear brothers and sisters. The saints that we have in a church lived and worked hard entire their life without stopping, without ceasing. And then they received the revelation of God who showed up to them. Read the story of St. Paisios. It's a beautiful story, how he had to prove someone that God exists. And he went into the desert and prayed and they didn't get any answer. And finally he did. And it's a beautiful story. I don't want to go into that, but you find it and read it. And the story of Zacchaeus, that he was despised by the society, and he also was transformed because of his diligence, because of his intelligence, because of his dedication for what he wanted to get and get any way he could, and not being shy to climb even a tree in front of everybody. Imagine the local bank manager climb a tree on the side of the street. Someone, what a funny sight that would be, right? That's what Zacchaeus was. He was a kind of, it was a tax collector, but it was kind of like a bank at that time, and he was a prominent member of that layer of society. And he goes and climbs a tree. And the Phoenician woman that I did not finish. I'll finish with the Phoenician woman. When Christ compares her to dogs, like I said earlier, there are two kinds of dogs. One that eats and runs, just a street dog. And what the fathers say, that the Phoenician woman compares herself to a domesticated, dedicated dog that sits under the table. Unless the dog is sitting under the table, will not be able to eat the crumbs that fall from the table. And what the fathers say about this woman, that she is so humble that she puts herself in relationship to Christ in a form of a servant, in a form of a dedicated servant. No other creature, maybe horses are second or first, whatever. One now, I've learned that two animals in the animal kingdom that are dedicated to humans in a complete way, that they will never betray their master, are the dogs and the horses. And that's the example that this Phoenician woman uses, that her relationship is not receive what you're asking for and never come back, but her relationship with Christ is like a domesticated, very dedicated, faithful creature that will eat from the crumbs Even if she doesn't get the best of the best, she will still serve the master and be dedicated to him. So that is what today I wanted us to understand, that our relationship with God is that kind of relationship, that it's based on a strong, very strong faith in our life, that we need to be convinced in our urge to reach out to Christ. And when we reach out to him, we need, and we establish the relationship. It is the discipleship that transpires from that. And that discipleship requires transparency. That, like this woman, we need to tell him everything about ourselves. He knows everything, anyways. He's not looking for secrets. It's not like we're going to open secrets to him. It's for our own sake that we need to overcome that hiding mode. Remember, in the Garden of Eden, God knew exactly where Adam and Eve were, but they were hiding. They, for their own sake, they needed to come out and reveal themselves to God, and not wait until God asks, "Where are you, Adam?" And so Christ is always looking for us like he was looking for these people whom he found, and he rejoiced. And remember, one soul that has been found creates a big party in heaven. The angels rejoice that one lost soul by God every single day, because every day we're a new person and we approach God in a new way, in a more transparent way, in a more dedicated way. Become closer disciple of Christ, and every day we discover ourselves and we reveal ourselves to God in a new way. May God bless you. Let us finish in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, now and forever, and to the ages of ages. Amen. May God bless you, and I will see you tonight at 7 o'clock. We will continue this text. I am so happy that you are participating in this way on those days, in these days that we are kind of homebound and home constrained, and we're staying home. But this is a very beautiful opportunity for me to learn the Bible, to review for my own salvation, and communicate it to you. Like Socrates or Plato, one of them said that the best way of learning is teaching. I am learning with you. May God bless you. Bye bye.